Welcome to the EconBuff podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today is Dr. Daniel Klein. Dan is a professor of economics and the JIN chair at the Mercatus Center, at George Mason University. He leads a program on Adam Smith at GMU, and he's the author of Smithian Morals and the chief editor of Econ Journal Watch. Dan, welcome.
Hi, Lee. Great to be with you.
So, Dan, our topic today is this statement of commitment to academic freedom and intellectual merit that you co-authored at GMU and the department at GMU. I guess not all of them, but a great number of them put their names to. And so, can you just briefly describe what this is and why you wrote it?
Yeah, first let me say I didn't write it. As you say, it was co-authored. Brian Kaplan, Don Boudreau, and others were significantly involved. And let me say that initially we thought along the lines of a collective departmental statement. That is a statement issued and posted by the econ department as such. But I had qualms about that all along. Think about these questions. How do you decide that it is right to issue a statement on behalf of a group when 75% support it? Is it 75% of those who vote or of the entire department? And how should we define the department? And how exactly do you register such support? Like if there's a vote, what if people abstain or indicate a position, neither support nor opposition? So for all those reasons, we had qualms about it doing it that way all along. It makes more sense to develop a statement and let each individual decide whether to put, his or her name to it. And that's what ended up happening. So as for why we wrote the statement, it's to affirm what I'd call traditional liberal values, which are under attack today, as I see it. Leftism, we know, dominates the universities and has taken over and become quite aggressive and increasingly illiberal, I would say. And so we're remonstrating against these sorts of attacks. The statement is an effort, if you will, to correct upward or to correct up. By correct up, I mean that we mere faculty in an ordinary department correct our superiors, that is our administrative superiors, the people in the university administration. When superiors start going wrong, if they are not corrected by their, organizational inferiors, then it may not be corrected at all. And then the whole institution might be run into the ground. And so we're facing these problems, and we wanted to make sure that our view and objection, just to voice the dissent, also to give voice to the silent sentiment and thought that's out there among people who are afraid to speak up.
So I ran across this first on Brian Kaplan's blog, Bet on It. I'll put a link in the show notes so that the listeners can find this. One of the things that he focuses on there is that he says he advocated in this process that you were talking about, we were co-authoring with Brian and Don and others, that he really pushed for the inclusion of intellectual meritocracy there. So I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about what's the importance of intellectual merit and sort of how it goes along with academic freedom.
Sure. Brian did advance the word merit, but I think we were getting at, what that's about as an issue. But he was right to emphasize the word merit. Traditionally, the way universities have worked is that scholars are organized in departments by fields, disciplines, and those departments judge of their own personnel affairs. Notions of merit bubble up from their knowledge, in their work as, a chemist or a linguist or a lawyer or a medical researcher or whatever the department or school is. That's really the whole character of liberal arts institutions, and administrators have traditionally rubber stamped the personnel decisions worked out by those subsidiary units of the larger university. It makes little sense for administrators with no knowledge of the field to supervene the decisions of the linguists or the medical researchers, or in our case, economists. Catholic social doctrine, by the way, calls it the principle of subsidiarity. So the call here is to preserve subsidiarity, the practice of letting judgments of merit bubble up from below rather than imposing decisions from above. Let me just say that, like, this principle of subsidiarity may be associated, among economists with decentralization, experimentation, independence, differentiation, criticism, heterodoxy, innovation, competition, I would say, and improvement. Such bottom-up processes offer prospects for the emergence of real leadership and excellence, I would say. And in political theory, you might associate subsidiarity with federalism, right? And by contrast, top-down structures can be associated with uniformity, and in the worst case, a sort of despotism and servility.
We have had Alex Salter on the podcast to talk about distributism. So we've actually had a fair bit of discussion about subsidiarity on the podcast here before. So listeners that have heard that episode will be familiar with that topic. So it's very interesting to see that brought around here and sort of applied. Think about that in a political sense, and how should we structure, which of course you mentioned, how do we structure a political system? You don't think about that in the context of an academy and applying to this intellectual merit idea. So
the Pope, the president of the university is a little bit like the Pope then. And you've got this enormous Catholic Church, and Catholic doctrine has said, let churches govern their local, diocese and churches and so on.
Absolutely. The idea with universities, I think, is a little different in hierarchical structure than you might have in other places. I find as a professor that I have to explain, my in our case, we don't have department heads, we have associate deans in my college, and those are not exactly like bosses. This is not the way that a corporation might run, where you kind of have to answer to every person in the line strictly above you. They have some authority and they can leverage a certain kind of authority, but as you said before, faculty have a way where we can sort of, I like that term, I'd never heard that, correct up, and we can put some pressure going from the bottom up in a way that's not going to happen in I think a lot of like corporate structures in particular. So so let's turn a little bit to the academic freedom part. Because we've talked about, you've linked that idea of intellectual merit to personnel decisions, but academic freedom seems a little broader, and so I just want you to discuss a little bit what the benefits of academic freedom are and why that's particularly important to universities.
Right. I think that first of all, people who say that science and scholarship have a kind of ethical bearing or purpose are really quite right. And good science and scholarship ought to be, or are, oriented toward the common good, if you will, the good of the whole of humankind. So those are really big questions, however. What constitutes the good, and how is it advanced? And the important thing is that people disagree about the answers to those, questions. They disagree quite profoundly and deeply. And so we need academic freedom to accommodate all of this disagreement, okay? And really, in a way, the genius of what I'd call liberal civilization that it says, let us disagree, let us discuss openly these disagreements, and that's our best way to develop better thoughts about the good and what advances the good. And you and I, who are in, moral philosophy, as Adam Smith would have called all of the social sciences and the humanities, this is, in a sense, what we're doing. We're talking about what's good public policy, right? And so good public policy is about advancing the good of the whole. And so this free speech and allowing academic freedom is our best way to, I think, avoid brutalizing each other in a kind of contest over a ring of power or something, or control of the university. And so liberal civilization affirms basic rules like free speech and other things like honesty, presumption of innocence, basic decency, and so on. And you can think of these kind of as social grammars. They don't answer the big questions, these basic grammars, just as basic grammar does not assure good writing. Lousy and uninspiring writing can be perfectly grammatical. But grammars are at least crucial to giving wings to good writing and good answers. Okay, so we need these grammars to, work out our and explore and experiment our, ideas and our discourse, our criticisms of each other, our challenges of each other to answer these big questions. That's a little bit like, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, how do we pursue happiness? By respecting the life and liberty of each other, basic grammar. And I think that if we forsake those liberal values and instead fall in with the current, hegemonic leftism of the academy, we get really a trouncing of these grammars. I mean, that's what I see them doing. We get a kind of despotism within the university, and I would say even within society at large, because in the political domain, leftism spells the governmentalization of social affairs. If you think about leftist sentiments and, ideas and policy proposals, for the most part, it points to the further governmentalization of social affairs. And I think, that's bad for humankind. So free speech, subsidiarity, these other liberal values are just crucial, I think, to keep this conversation open and genuine and, keep us kind of, we hope, on an upward path.
So your view here is, this idea of intellectual merit towards personnel decisions, and your idea of academic freedom in regards to debate. I think when my listeners hear free speech, right, they're thinking about like public discourse. They're thinking about like what they might see or hear in media and stuff like this. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, or you're talking about a narrower focus towards the academy?
Well, for the merit issue, again, I'm concerned about pressures from the administration to conduct our personnel decisions certain ways, to put the thumb on the scale, to interfere and pressure the subsidiary units, because the subsidiary units are afraid that if they don't follow the clear preferences of the administration will punish them, will maybe not approve the appointment or the offer of the appointment. Just in any number of ways, make trouble for, the subsidiary unit. I mean, there's a great deal of trouble they can make in many, many ways in just institutional life, right? Day by day. So there's a great deal of kind of intimidation and bullying going on. Also in the messaging from the administration, these different emails they send out to your department or even to the whole university community, kind of pressuring you and putting a chill on people and making it hard to deviate or question or speak out against, their leftist views. So that's what's in terms of this university setting, I guess the main thing I'm concerned about with the merit issue on speech, they also want to, intervene in our curricula. They want to promote certain things, and they might frown on certain things. Again, they might frown in a kind of indirect way, which pressures you away from certain things and punishes you even for not towing the line or for challenging leftist ideas and so on and so forth, for exposing some of the fraudulence and shallowness of some of the slogans that they depend on and throw around so much. So the free speech can be attacked in a lot of many different subtle ways. It can be required training sessions. It can be encouraging students to kind of monitor and challenge and criticize and make a fuss about whatever. Yeah, and just basic personnel decisions of people not getting promoted, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly kind of what I was getting at. Is we see different pressures at universities in different places, and here I don't know if we've gotten, like you said, there's lots of different ways for this pressure to sort of manifest. But there's even those kind of discussions, even at a relatively conservative university like the one that I'm at, where people are looking at the distribution of genders or races in different departments and colleges, and that's where I want to circle around to this issue in a minute, because I have another question I want to ask you in between. But that's where the statement like really stood out to me, as sort of jumping out as when we're in a hiring decision at my university, I want, or my department in particular, I want the best person that we can get. I want somebody that's doing interesting and important and creative work. I want somebody that's going to teach their classes well. I want somebody that, is going to be somebody that I want to have as a colleague for a long time. And I don't particularly care which diversity, other than viewpoint diversity, which is a word that you have in your statement. I don't really care which diversity boxes, and I think that's how it should be, right? Is that if this is a person that does or doesn't fit certain diversity goals, should be irrelevant if the work that they're doing is good, important to the field, is high quality stuff. So that's kind of what I wanted to get at. But let me turn the question just a little bit, right? Because that's sort of that broader question that I was talking about, public discourse and hiring and whatnot. But I'm also very interested in how the reduced academic freedom might have consequences for peer-reviewed research, for economic literature, or for scientific literature in general. I think we live in a society where people really they understand the importance of, they try to reference the research shows or something whenever they're making some kind of arguments and debates, and that might be the most superficial way that kind of thing is important. These things, like you said earlier, affect policy decisions, and this kind of stuff should be done in pursuit of truth. Can you just comment a little bit on what you think the consequences of reduced academic freedom are in research?
Yeah, sure. And I think they're along the lines you're suggesting. But just before I go there, Lee, let me just also mention another thing, and kind of in reference to what we were talking about, the issue of merit and pressures, is the requirement of these so-called diversity statements, which we condemn in our statement. Like, that's another very, very plain and obvious pressure that really can screw up and, alter the whole job search process. It can affect who wants to apply for the job, right? And then if you're concerned, you and the department are concerned that the administration is going to consult these so-called diversity statements where people are supposed to, express their fealty to these leftist slogans, just think that's a very, very direct intervention in the whole process. Okay, so let me pick up with what you ask about scholarly research and so forth. Let's think about the academic journals and so on. And I mean, basically, we're seeing the scholarly and academic world increasingly dominated by leftism, if you will. And as I see it, leftism is very concerned to stick with and kind of shore up leftist political groups and their associated slogans, narratives, selfhoods, and so on. It's kind of almost like the powerful government is like this force that's almost sucking academic institutions into its vortex, and it's all part of this larger social phenomenon. And the academic institutions are being corrupted, I would say, by a kind of society-wide politicization of things. So anyway, I see this strong tendency to depart from in the journals and academia generally to depart from the basic norms of scholarship to serve these rather tendentious political ends. And such departures from scholarly norms they can be from careerism, but of course they also come from this kind of false political orientation, I would say. Because I mean, I'm working from a kind of presupposition that it's wrong-headed to be leftist. I mean, we can debate that on another day or something, but that is just where I come from. That's like my judgment as a person, and I would also say as a scholar and as an economist. So anyway, the exploitation of scholarly journals and the rest of academic institutions to advance the interests of one's political tribe really spells the corruption of science and scholarship. And unfortunately, most of the journals and organizations are mired, I think, in that sort of leftism nowadays. Not all of them, but most of them.
There's a question that I wanted to ask based on some of what Alex DeBerrick put in his blog when he posted this statement here that I think touches on this point of there's a certain politicization of research, and whereas I think this ideal that we've been pursuing, hopefully as academics and scientists, is to seek out the truth sort of wherever that may lead, as sort of that highest goal. And if you make scholarship serve ends like you're talking about, like political ends in particular, and then you sort of use the career leverage and the different things that we've talked about that universities can do, to where if you can lose your job for saying the wrong thing, then you're having to pay a really high price potentially in order to pursue the truth, and universities should insulate scholars from that. I think that's part of their job. You say that very well, obviously, in the statement itself also. But it just occurs to me that there's this downstream effect of that, where you kind of get this knock on of, if you allow things like academic freedom to be eroded, and then professors, scholars and researcher scientists, they have to make choices between, do I pursue the truth, or do I say the things that get me to tenure, perhaps, or whatever it is that would be an advancement. For other fields, econ, this is not as common, but for other fields, get research grants and funding and stuff like that. Then you then make it to where the research and the scholarship that does come out, it becomes politically tinted as well. And then we don't know what to trust, right? So
Absolutely.
Can you look at my research and say, he's saying this because he thinks this is where the theories lead and what the empirical work bears out? Or is this because he had to make a choice between feeding his family and writing the paper that he thought he should have written? Do you have any comments just kind of on that, sort of the knock-on effects or the downstream consequences?
It's a huge damage to society at large. I would even say to our civilization. It's like this corruption is destroying the authority of institutions, organizations, processes, that is science, scholarship, the news, the law, you name it, that we really hope to trust and used to place more trust in. But when this political effect becomes more and more pronounced and falsehoods are issued on a larger and larger and more persistent and tenacious scale, we lose trust and they lose their authority. And we are more, out at sea, right? Because we don't know quite whom to turn to. I mean, making sense of the world is very much a kind of a matter of consulting different people's interpretations and judgments. And so there's, if you like, in a healthy civilization, there's kind of a healthy landscape of judgment to kind of refer to, and organize around and take into consideration. And you hope that there's a kind of respectfulness and maybe a kind of sense of a central zone of where the valuable conversation is taking place. And then you hope it's responsible to the larger issues of the society. And when we see our institutions lose authority and us lose faith in them, it's not like there's some immediate alternative that, right, we can all organize and coordinate around, So it's a very, very serious. I think this is how, civilizations can fall into very serious decline and decadence. And I'm afraid we might be doing that, actually.
There's a really deep thought that you sort of started with there, which is, and this has been something that others have said and something that I've been thinking about. It's actually hard to, on virtually any topic, decide for yourself. When we have to make decisions, it's actually who to trust, not what is the right answer, and how do we draw those things out. I remember my oldest is 8 years old, and my wife and I were making some various medical decisions, just run of the mill kind of stuff. And my wife is actually from the medical profession. She'd been a nurse for over 10 years. And so she had some things that she was worried about. And so I was doing some research, and back then, I just went to the CDC and I saw what they were saying, and just, okay, this is just the gospel truth, more or less. And that's been shaken in the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know that I've thrown them out completely. But the different institutions, and of course, I think when people hear that, they immediately think governmental institutions, but lots of institutions just, can I take this and just, add that in as data, or do I have to start sorting out at some deeper level, and who is it that I can trust? And once trust erodes, that's a really hard thing to get back. And I think there is a real risk of what you were talking about, where you can start down a path that you can't come back from if you erode all the trust, and if everything becomes politically motivated, everything becomes I'll just say it, infected by leftism. You can't operate, and different groups of people can't operate together. One of my colleagues here, he says econ is principally the study of coordination. Right. That's really what it is that we're thinking about, and what it is that economists are trying to figure out. And trust and different institutional systems is part of that coordination problem. And I don't think you can disentangle those things. So let me turn a little bit, unless you had a comment on that.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. So let me turn a little bit, because you and I have kind of been talking about the left and the right. But when Alex put this up on his blog, he said that academic freedom and intellectual merit are under attack in the United States from both the left and the right, which I think is just sort of obviously true. But I wanted your comments on that as to how that pertains specifically to the statement that you and your co-authors, you and your colleagues put together.
Well, the impetus is clearly the problems emanating from the left, which completely dominates the academy. I also think there's a big asymmetry just in the leftist tendency to be illiberal and to abuse the social grammars. Now, that's not to say that there aren't threats from the right. But I don't think Alex was really suggesting that they were, of equal magnitudes. He didn't specify about the magnitude or the relative magnitudes, and I think they obviously are not at all equal. Let me also just say, by the way, that I don't really believe that the right is a thing. I think what we really have is the left and the non-left. We can get into that if you like, but maybe that's something for another day. But the threats, look, in some ways, when you see stuff like in Florida happening, we're kind of in a trap, because once some people started abusing things and seizing a ring of power and abusing power, it's very hard to just say, oh, I renounce power, because in a way you're relinquishing the ring of power to those people. And so you try to wrestle the ring of power back from them to some extent. And so we're in this predicament. And in fact, if universities were more based entirely on voluntary funding, voluntary participation, I think we would have less of this trouble. I mean, we don't have this trouble so much when it's private sector institutions, depending on, the payments and contributions and participation of voluntary participants. But when it's highly governmentalized, as it is, and, I myself work for the Commonwealth of Virginia at a public sector university, then, we get into these other mechanisms of possible correction of certain problems and issues of kind of centralized control and large scale control, kind of like the ring of power. So I'm just saying that if you want less threats, whether from the left or the right, one way to do that, I think, is just to reduce government funding in all its forms for universities. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that one of the reasons there's as much demand for university education, why people are applying and willing to pay to go to these universities, is because they are degrees from them as accredited institutions may be required for the occupational paths that people pursue. And that induces a demand to go to those privileged institutions, which then, as it were, confer you with privileges as a practitioner, whether it's an accountant or an architect or an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer or what have you. And so if you liberalized these requirements on entering, different occupations, that too would degovernmentalize the issue to some extent. And I think, therefore, this would just be less of a big problem for us to fight over. Just like in other private affairs, it's like, well, if you don't like the way certain people or friendship groups or churches do things, you just decide not to go there, not to support them, right? Does that help?
Absolutely. So there are a couple things I wanted to dive in there. The first, on your notion of there may not be a right in the way, a right wing, if you will, in the way that people sort of think about that. I remember reading I think it's the very last chapter in Hayek's Constitution on Liberty, and he basically, makes this argument that, the conservatives, they're not really conserving anything. They're just doing progressive things slower. And so he would prefer to be called other things. And then spends part of the chapter trying to work on like what that name might be, and that's where for a long time, I would have identified myself as a classic liberal trying to sort of move away from conservatism. Is that the kind of, not conservatism as like the values, but like as a political party affiliation,
Mm.
tribal affiliation? You mentioned the word tribe earlier. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about here, or do you have something else in mind?
That relates to what I'm talking about and kind of illustrates it, because what you're pointing out is that among the non-left, there's diversity, as it were. And you do have like big government conservatives and other kinds of interventionist conservatives. And then you have more classical liberal types. And you have other types who, look, the word conservative in the US context has a number of meanings. It's got a lot of meanings, right? But one of the important ones means, and is it's used as, this person thinks the Republicans are the lesser evil. And so in that sense, the right, or the right, people on the right are people who think the Republicans are the lesser evil. And that puts me on the right because I think the Republicans are the lesser evil. But what you're showing is that, well, that's still very diverse.
Yes.
There's these different kinds of conservatives, there's the classical liberal types, all sorts in between, and other varieties that just don't fit left and just don't like support the left party in that country. And so they're non-left. Steven Pinker gives, I think, a really useful metaphor on all of this. He speaks of the left pole, analogous to the North Pole. When you're up at the North Pole, just think of the upper half of a globe, like a hemisphere, northern hemisphere. And so you've got the North Pole. Any direction away from that pole is south. But they can be in completely opposite directions, but they're not
Right.
north. And so I think that's the way actually right and left work and have been working for like 150 years. So in other words, you've got more diversity on the non-left. You've got a certain coherence, more essential characteristics, I think, to the left, which gives it that kind of like left pole character. And then if you're somehow not comfortable with that and you don't fit in with that and they don't fit in with you and they don't smile on you, they're going to call you right. Like whatever it is, a Nazi, a conservative, a NASCAR lover, religious people, traditionalists, you name it, pro-life people. If you don't fit in with them, business groups, and so on, you're on the right. So there's really left and non-left. When you hear the word the right, like, listen, we've been talking about leftism. That's because there's a certain coherence, I think, to it and character to it. No one talks about rightism.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, there's no corresponding rightism to the leftism. Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Mm-hmm.
So the there's a sense in which there could be as much leftism as as people sympathetic to that would prefer, if universities they're not funded by government money, if they're not just competing for shares of state budgets, they might not really have, I don't want to say that, they'd be able to be represented in universities and have their say and have their place at the table, just like those of us that are non-left, and sitting down and discussing. And if their ideas went out, their ideas went out. But that's not really how this is playing out, right? As you said before, now we got hiring that's got diversity statements involved, or we have research and grant funding, or we have the scholarship itself in the peer-reviewed journals. You kind of have to fit into the correct category to be able to play the game. So in your view, because I think I don't think anybody would disagree with the notion that probably leftism is overrepresented in academics. I just kind of want to ask the chicken or the egg question, like which do you think came first? Because you're proposing here, right? If universities are less dependent on government money, this there's no enforcement mechanism for the kind of problems that your statement is against.
That is, if there was less government funding and involvement, it would be less of a problem, right? What we're concerning ourselves with. I think that's true. Think about a fully private university and it decided it wanted to be really lefty. Who would care? Who would complain? I mean, that's their business. It's just like if people want to go start a commune, go ahead. So is there a question then, what comes first, the government funding or the problem of leftism? Is that kind of
it's specifically in academics, right? Is it because academics is it because it went left and then they kind of weaponized government funding, or is it from outside the university? And then
I personally think you got to think about a very, very broad civilizational narrative within which academia is like a significant part, but not like the only part. And, it's actually, I think it really makes sense to go back and look at the whole arc of classical liberalism from the early modern period, at least, or even if you like going back to Christianity, because I do think Christianity made liberalism possible along the lines that Larry Siedentop argues. But anyway, in the later years, so you've got this kind of rising. First of all, you got the rise of nation states, and then there's the liberal arc that says, "Hey, let's make it a liberal nation state." And there's quite a bit of success and ascendancy to that tendency for a number of reasons. And then there's a kind of reversal. There's a huge reversal, which I guess really takes place, you could say, in the Anglo sphere at the end of the 19th century, when the intellectual classes just really abandoned liberalism, and the young were no longer brought up in the way they had been in sort of believing in liberal intuitions and precepts and ideas. And then you move into the 20th century and you have catastrophe. And so there's been a big reversal. And the growth of the universities in the United States, at least, comes in that latter period, especially. So it's a very bad time for these institutions to be expanding in that sense. So I fit it more into the whole larger thing. And I take the whole thing as a kind of civilizational challenge and problem. There was sort of chaos in Europe before the nation state. And then there was a kind of ascendancy of a liberal nation state in certain parts of the world. But the nation state creates this centralizing, awesome power that becomes very imposing. And then, like, that power started becoming the problem in a really huge way. And Tocqueville warned of this. This is the whole point of his great masterpiece, Democracy in America, like to warn us that this is happening. He saw it very plainly in France. He sort of anticipated it in the United States. And here we are. He was absolutely right.
This brings me very excellently along to kind of where I wanted to end this podcast. I saw the statement come across all these various blogs that I'm reading and economists whose work that I admire, in several dimensions. And it did exactly what Bryan Caplan was saying. One of the motivations is a statement might do nothing, but you're putting that out there for other people in other places, me, to see this and say, okay, there's somebody out there who's wanting to defend academic freedom and intellectual merit. And so I just wanted to ask you that question. my what I have done so far in my career is, first tell no lies. It's just I won't assent to anything that I don't agree with. You can't put my name on anything that I don't agree with, which is obviously another admirable thing of what you've done here, right? Is making a statement that people can sign their names to. Um, and so I just wanted any input that you had, what other professors in other places, for my purposes, a division two school, not a, tier one research academic, like what are some things that somebody like me might be able to do about this issue?
Well, you're doing it, obviously, Lee, and you're voicing your dissent. You're giving platform to others who voice their dissent. You're exploring the issue. You're justifying, your reasons for dissenting. I'm sure you would invite people to debate, right? If somebody wanted to come on, is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yes.
I think that would be, that's always exciting. It's a hard thing actually to make happen, but so you're doing it. But in general, do think about collaborating with peers and talking about these problems and issues and thinking about whether to organize a little something that does kind of correct up. That is to say, kind of speaks or voices your dissent and direct it to your superiors, organizational superiors, in the hope of correcting them, just so that they at least know that like people aren't, necessarily all buying their bullshit. And that they should expect some resistance, and then that might inspire others to do likewise. And you discover friends and like-minded people through doing these kinds of activities. That in itself is very rewarding. That kind of thing. I think all we, in some sense, all we can do is discourse. I mean, as liberals, that's like what we don't want to battle over the ring of power. We don't want to brutalize each other over the ring of power. So, we do discourse. We do persuasion, we hope.
That's kind of a difficult catch 22, right? Where the problem is the things that we were talking about earlier, the places to put pressure and the funding and the and then people like us are out here saying don't use that stuff, don't do that to people. And there's kind of a way in which it's, I don't want to say it's baked in for that liberal mindset to lose, but it at least presents a very serious challenge. Do you have any thoughts on sort of how to balance those two things, right? So
you do have to compromise. I'm not, not everybody should stick their neck out so far. I compromise myself and sometimes feel fearful, for sure. Let me also just say that, it's not totally dark. I mean, there is a power to wisdom and truth and virtue, and it's that power is not all lost at all. The force is still out there. And so don't feel like you're so powerless, because good reasoning, good interaction, good engagement does have a power of its own. And that's what, the whole dynamic, competitive, open process is supposed to be, bringing forth and channeling properly. So don't despair too much. Yeah.
no, that's a great thing to hear, and just kind of hopefully other people that are listening hear this and be thinking about those kind of things. So I want to bring this in for a landing. So I wanted to get your thought sort of on one last thing, which would just be, if someone like me, I have a little bit of a platform and I'm tenured. And so this is a big advantage like that. And I know Brian was commenting some on his blog of like why people might not come along with this kind of thing. Can you comment just very briefly on individuals like, not to lump me in with you, but like you and me that have some security, where a lot of people are going to feel with their careers and their choices like you feel a little bit of nervousness about doing this kind of thing, and because of that, I think it's important that people that are I don't know if safer is the word, people that are in a place to do this kind of thing, that we kind of have a little moral responsibility to do that.
Yeah,
Can you comment
we
on
all
that
have.
briefly?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think all of us have some responsibility to dissent, or to voice our dissent, to think for ourselves. But certainly that forwardness in doing so rises in the kind of responsibility calculus as you have more security. Absolutely. So we should expect more from more senior people. And to some extent, I think that is what we tend to see. That could also just be cohort effects, of course. But you're young, and there are other young people who are showing this kind of mettle.
My guest today has been Dan Klein. Dan, thanks for joining us on the EconBuff.
Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EconBuff. You can find all previous episodes on YouTube at EconBuff Podcast. You can check out our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. That's WIXSIT.com. You can contact us at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.